Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster 2, and welcome to Poltergeist. This is a medieval castle-themed Eurofighter with some indoor sections and an indoor lift hill as well, which is also going to be a blueprint, so you can check out the code in the description and try it out for yourself. And before I go further into this video, quick apology for my voice not being quite what it usually should be. I'm a little bit sick, unfortunately, and especially unfortunately, I'm not quite sick enough to call in sick to work, so I have been working from home, which unfortunately means not as much Planet Coaster time, but I can't in good consciousness call myself sick enough to stop doing that, but at the same time, it has been affecting my voice and just overall the state of being, so there's that. I'm just gonna try to keep my voice low enough and avoid speaking in a YouTube voice too much, so that hopefully I will survive this video. That said, I've been trying for a layout for this type of coaster for a while, and this is eventually the layout I ended up with after a few failed attempts. In my failed attempts, I was mostly trying to build a castle that was way too big and go for a layout with multiple indoor sections and dark ride sections. But I think that was just a bit too ambitious, especially to fit into a blueprint as well, given the fact that I'm gonna have to make the castle pieces custom. So eventually I ended up with this layout, which is more of the standard fare for Eurofighter, I'd say. So Gerstlauer, the company that builds these things, for some reason really loves building this type of coaster with an indoor dark ride section that's quite short and also has a JoJo roll, which is a barrel roll before the lift hill, and it's to the point that whenever I ride these things in real life, I always forget that they have one, and I'll ride it and I'll be like, oh, of course, we're gonna do another barrel roll just before the lift hill. So recently I rode Smiler in the UK, which is technically an infinity coaster, but it's kind of similar, and I totally forgot it had a barrel roll at the start as well. So, not to add any spoilers for this type of ride in real life, but if you see one of these rides and the station is located inside a big building, you probably already see what's coming. Anyway, after that we have a vertical lift hill with a beyond vertical drop, followed by an Immelman inversion, an airtime hill, and then this helix into a zero-G roll type of movement. And then the second half of the layout is, funnily enough, going to be the same variety of elements, just kind of mirrored. And I don't mean mirrored in a sense that the elements or their variation is mirrored, but instead we're doing the same elements just from front to back instead of from the back to front, or vice versa. So instead of an Immelman, we are starting the second half off with a dive loop, then we go into an airtime hill that transitions into a helix, and the helix, or actually no, yeah, then we have an airtime hill that transitions into a roll into a helix, instead of having an airtime hill into a helix into a roll. So eventually this layout is kind of two-way symmetrical if you look at it from the air, and it's kind of funny that despite all this, I still feel like it works to give you a sensation of different forces and enough variety as you ride this thing, because the variety of elements does mean that you get different forces throughout the entire layout. Plus, by the time we're here at the end, the roll is going to give more hang time than whip, because you're going through it so quickly that I think that's it's a fun layout overall, especially for a Eurofighter. For some reason these coasters are one of my favorite coaster types. I can't explain this. They're not the smoothest, they're definitely not the most unique in terms of elements or anything like that. It's just, they're so cute. I love their little trains, I love the simplistic designs that they have, I love the shaping of some of the elements. It's hard to predict when you ride one of these things what the elements will be shaped like. If you ride a B&M floorless coaster, for example, you already know what that loop is going to feel like. They're all shaped perfectly and calculated very well. With these things, it's sometimes more of a hang and bang, but I think that also has a charm to it that I really like, and just the overall cuteness of these rides. They manage to pack in many elements in a very small amount of space, much better than most other coaster types. So overall bang for your buck, I think, is really good. And yeah, I appreciate them. And I know that it's a little bit controversial out there in the coaster enthusiast world. So I just want to say, Gerstlauer Eurofighters, I'm here for you. I love you. Anyway, I'm doing this indoor lift hill section because indoor vertical lift hills are another thing that this coaster type does really well in real life. I can think of a number of examples already. Mystery Mine in Dollywood is one that I haven't been on myself, but it looks super cool. My personal favorite is probably Flucht von Novgorod in Hansa Park in Germany, which has a really cool indoor vertical lift hill. Just overall theming and layout on that thing is really cool. Actually, no, scratch that. I just went on a whole tangent about how Flucht von Novgorod is really amazing, but it's a ride that is probably best experienced unspoiled without knowing anything about anything that happens. It does have a vertical lift hill, but aside from that, I think the other things that happen indoors are probably best not to know when you ride it. And that goes for every ride in Hansa Park, by the way. So if you are by chance planning to go to Hansa Park in the near future, don't look up any POVs or anything about their roller coasters. They all have their secrets and they're best enjoyed with their secrets still intact. And I think that probably also goes for this coaster that I am building here, even though you guys can all see what's happening here, so you already know there's going to be a barrel roll in the indoor section there. But I think that's one of the fun parts of this type of coaster, hiding your stuff so that first-time visitors have no idea what to expect. So on this coaster, I am hiding everything but the main layout. So as the car is doing its thing, going around the Immelmans and dive loops and airtime hills, sure, you can see it go around. But the moment it starts to near the station, we're gonna go indoors again. And everything before the first drop is also hidden from view. So my plan is, as you leave that station, you go into a little castle room, which is very dimly lit, and then you go into darkness, and you don't know where you're going, and then you have that steep but tiny drop at the start there, and a curve moving into a barrel roll that goes so slowly that it is probably going to give excruciating... That was a disgusting way to say excruciating. Let me try that again. Excruciating hang time. And then you move into a vertical lift hill out of nowhere. And you finally start seeing some daylight in the far distance. And by that time, you should probably have your socks spooked off already. And then you still have to enjoy the rest of the layout. At least, that's my plan. I think these coasters are also really good at horror themes. For some reason, many Eurofighters out there in the world have some sort of horror or scary, dark, foreboding theme. But I think that just goes very well with their elements as well. Now, another thing that I am planning to do here is this tower is kind of my main proof of concept for this whole build. So that's also why I started out with this tower, even though it's probably the most interesting thing about the castle in the end. My main idea about this was that I wanted to try that stone texture down there, which you can see, which is made up of a bunch of different pieces. Most of them are in the Viking set, so we have the stone walls from the Viking set, but then also some of the rocky stone fence walls looking things from the Viking set. I'm actually not sure what they're called by heart, but they're a rough, very textured stone wall that I decided to sink into some of those walls to give them extra textures and make it look like some of the cobblestones are jutting out a bit. And then in addition to that, I'm using the decal pieces to also create some pieces where it looks like maybe they stuccoed in a bit, or there's some mud or cement or random bits and pieces of different textures, which is the kind of thing that tends to happen to old castles when they get, you know, patched over centuries and their entire wall becomes a mishmash of all kinds of different textures, which is something that I think is very typical and kind of necessary for building a castle that looks somewhat old. And on top of that patchwork of different stone textures, we have this timber frame section. And this was inspired, actually, by a castle in real life. I'm not very much following the shape of the castle in real life, so I think in the end this building is quite unique, and there's not really anything that I can think of directly that really looks like it. But my main inspiration was the castle in Wernigerode in the Harz area of Germany, which is a place that I visited last year on a small solo trip when I was just doing my stuff in Germany and checking out fairy tale looking towns. And the Harz area in general is really beautiful. I was kind of taken aback just how not so popular of a place it is to visit. Definitely not for people from the Netherlands, but in general it seemed very quiet. Sometimes I was really the only person walking around these towns. Now, I was also there just before the holiday season, so maybe not the very best time of year. This was somewhere in mid-December, I think. But yeah, it felt like a kind of underexplored gem. But I think that's also part of what makes the region so distinct. I believe it's a region that is not so much economically doing too well the last few decades. It also used to be part of East Germany, largely. And I think that's partly also what made these medieval towns that they have in this area so well preserved. Usually, when a city gets too rich, they start demolishing their buildings for shiny new buildings somewhere in the 20th century. But that never happened to some of the Harz mountain towns like Quedlinburg, Goslar and Wernigerode. And the latter, especially, has this really cool castle perched on top of a hill looking out over the city, and you can see it from almost every angle in the city, and it's really cool. It has been majorly restored in the 19th century, so it's a bit of a revisionist castle, but it's got this really cool combination of stone textures, but also in the middle of the castle some timber work with red wooden beams that looks super cool, and was one of my favorite buildings that I've seen on that whole trip. And that is kind of what inspired this building. Not necessarily in shape or any particular elements, but that combination of the rough, rocky cobblestone textures of the walls and the timber frame walls above that with the red wooden beams, that I thought was a really cool combination. So that's going to be the main inspiration for this castle. Now, what I also wanted to do is add a door, a custom door, at the drop here, and I was struggling a little bit more with this than I am willing to admit, trying to get these movements right, but eventually I did get it, and I realized that these rotating pieces are making custom doors possible in whichever way you want to. Obviously this is a door made out of big window shutters that open as a regular window shutter would. As you can tell here, it took a lot of movement trying to get them right, because I did want these shutters to rotate around their hinges, which meant that I had to do a lot of precision placement in respect to where the rotating piece is. But you can do just about any moving door you want to. You can very well also do sliding doors, or garage doors that rotate upwards, or combinations. I mean, you have to remember, you can combine different rotating pieces as well. So I think the amount of flexibility that these rotating pieces give you when it comes to creating custom gates and doors is huge, and something that's going to be very fun to play with in dark rides. And I highly recommend trying it yourself if you ever want to do a dark ride or a themed coaster of some sort. But that's it for the door. At this point it's functional, and as you could see, it opens when the car passes by. Next, I wanted to add something to this tower because it felt a little bit empty, like it was just a little bit too simple. And part of the reason for that is the roof. I am going back at some point in the future and fixing the roof up a little bit, because right now it's just a straight spire. But eventually I realized that looks a little bit wrong, so I made it a bit pointier, which is better looking, I think. But besides that, I still felt like I wanted some extra decoration on the side here. So I'm adding a little side spire with probably a cool room in the middle of it. You know, if this were actually to have an interior, because the real interior of this building is just a hallway for the vertical lift hill to go through. And I think that's just the kind of thing that this tower needed. I am really trying to watch out with my pieces here, because even today I was just casually browsing Reddit looking for builds that people were doing, and I was getting called out for making window frames out of 10k pieces. And look, I know I've done my fair share of that kind of stuff in the past, but with these builds I am really trying to restrict myself to few enough pieces that I can turn these things into blueprints, which means less than 4,000 pieces a blueprint, which also means that a 10k window frame is, well, just one window frame wouldn't fit in two blueprints even, so I can't do any of that. But worse than that is the fact that I love making custom spires out of small wooden pieces to really get a feeling for what kind of roof shape I want. And it's really fun doing these things because, as I am doing with this spire here, you just have to do one side, and if you plan it right and build around the grid well enough, you can copy that side around very easily and make custom spires. It's a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of pieces. And I want to add more spires to this building, quite a few actually, but if you don't watch out, every spire is a couple hundred pieces, and with a blueprint with under 4,000 pieces, with dark ride sections and stations and queues and rockwork and foliage still to do, I can't do any of that. So I'm trying to keep my spires very economical and simple, is what I'm trying to say, and that was one of my main goals for this build. Make it look like it's a very complex build that should have probably taken thousands of pieces more, but keep it relatively simple in the meantime. Now moving on, I'm working on the station building here, which is going to be the Great Hall of this castle. I'm generally not going to follow any kind of strict castle layouts, so this is not going to be a super realistic castle, but at least I wanted to make it feel believable. So for a sort of believable looking layout, I want to make sure that we have a big main hallway in the middle, which is going to be my station, because that's realistically what should be the fanciest and coolest looking place in this entire ride, and also what I just need all of that space for as well, because I wanted to include the entrance and exit path in that big hallway as well. And this hallway is going to be built out of big wooden pieces, mostly, and then I'll build my walls and stuff around it. Now, my inspiration for this was actually kind of an unexpected source, I think. I was looking up pictures of big halls in different German castles, but I couldn't find anything that was simple enough to my liking, because I wanted to theme this like it's an actual medieval castle, like not one of those castles that was fancied up in the 19th century. Very often if you see castles like this, you'll look at it from the outside, you'll think, oh, that's a very nice medieval castle, and then you go in and the entire interior is Baroque and over the top and all that. No, I just wanted to keep this relatively simple, and eventually the place where I found the inspiration that I was looking for was the Ridderzaal in the Parliament building of the Netherlands, which is the main hallway of the Dutch Parliament. Not quite a German castle, but it does feel like a space that could realistically have been the Great Hall of a medieval castle in Germany as well. It's quite similar to many great halls in castles, I find. I also recently visited the Muiderslot, which is a castle near Amsterdam, which I highly recommend visiting if you're in the area. It's a really cool castle and also quite well preserved. It doesn't have too many 19th century additions or anything like that still there, so it's relatively medieval looking still. And it also has a style that's very reminiscent of this. So that's what I ended up with. I did color the walls of this castle because I figured it would be really cool to make it look like one of those halls that has some sort of wallpaper on the side that is fancy in some way. Except in this case it is just colored plaster, but it felt like more fun to do than just to keep things white. And then for the outside of the building, I knew I wanted to go for a stepped gable, and I was looking at stepped gables in German architecture because they are quite common, but I couldn't really make it work with the pieces. As you can tell, I tried something here, but it just ended up looking a little bit weird. And eventually I settled with making it a regular stepped gable, so it's not quite as unique or fancy, but I think it looks a bit better in the grand scheme of things. So that's what this outside wall ended up looking like. And speaking of interior and exterior walls, this is something that I'm going to be applying everywhere in the castle, because I want all the interiors to be stuccoed up, as you very frequently see inside castles like this, and all the exterior is just a raw, natural stone. So that also means we basically have two pieces, one for each side, on every wall in this castle. So that's also going to make it a little bit more of a challenge to keep it under 4,000 pieces. It's just going to be a bit of a puzzle. I also added some decals here to give a bit of a grimy texture to the walls as well. And here and there, I also took one of these stone walls and scaled it up a little bit and also sunk it into the texture. So as you can see, it's a very similar texture all throughout the buildings, but somewhere you can see some bigger boulders than in other places, which is also, I think, a little realistic touch for a facade like this. Also completely unrelated, but something that I noticed later on when I started lighting these places up is that the way that lighting interacts with this stone texture is really cool. You can really see the light lining up small ridges on these walls and also casting shadows underneath some of these cobbles, even though this is just a flat wall. And I believe this is done with bump mapping. Not an expert on these kinds of things, but in any case, Frontier did a good job on these textures, I think, because it looks really cool, especially when you light them up. So that's it for the Great Hall of the station. I'm not adding anything else that's too fancy. I think the wooden beams and just overall structure holding up that very tall roof is the most interesting part about that building. And then here we have the mid-course, well, no, this is not a mid-course brake run. We just have a brake run, which also has the block brakes, giving this coaster its block brake sections. As of now, this coaster only has 2 block brake sections, and I might actually increase this to give it an extra block, because 2 trains feels like not enough for a coaster of this size. So I'll add a block at the start as well. Or well, I guess it's actually something that you can do yourself if you give this thing a download, because it does work alright. I think with 3 stations it might actually cause some stacking. It's not optimal, but right now it's definitely not the maximum theoretical capacity either. But you know, that's also something that you'll see with Gerstlauer Eurofighters. They're not the biggest capacity coasters. They're perfect for maybe some smaller parks, or if you do manage to slap a whole bunch of brake runs on them, but they're not the capacity monsters that infinity coasters can be. So anyway, this extra side hallway, which is like an extra expansion to the castle, and I guess could be a residential corner or something like this if this were to be an actual castle, is my way of hiding the station from view and making sure that as soon as you leave the main layout, you start entering the castle again and everything is once again hidden from plain sight. And on the sides of this, I also decided to add these little stone elements. Eventually, I opted against adding battlements on these, because as much as they are a typical castle feature, I felt like they just didn't quite work out on this castle here. And I can imagine that there has been a bit of remodeling this castle over the years. So maybe at some point of time there would have been battlements here with walkways to fight from, but somewhere in some revision of the castle they got lost. You know, not to mention that in a much more recent revision of the castle, a roller coaster has been added to it. So why am I even paying this much attention to the realism of it? But that's just my head lore for this castle. Now, I am building this tunnel out of way too big pieces of stone, as you can tell, but don't worry, I'm adding some of these extra big textured stones, which are the Viking wall decoration, there it is, to it to give it some extra texture, and I think eventually with the lighting that's going to work quite well, especially given the fact that, how I just explained, the way that lighting affects some of these stone textures is really cool, and eventually that makes this tunnel a really cool dark experience, I think, because you can barely see anything except some of those lanterns hanging from the ceiling and very dimly lighting up these walls. And as you go through that barrel roll, it's going to be a very disorienting kind of procedure where you lose sight a little bit, probably, of what's up and down, especially given how slow this maneuver goes. And I think that's a big fun part of this. Very often, these indoor barrel rolls on Eurofighters tend to be completely pitch black, which I think is a little bit of a shame. It's a fun sensation, but I think it's also fun to see the world revolve around you, so to speak. So I decided to add a few lights to still keep it very dark and scary, but at the same time still very clearly give you that sensation of going upside down. Plus, what's the point of going upside down indoors if you can't even see it? You really have to make people feel it, I think. There are so many indoor coasters that don't go upside down, that have all these crazy stories about how they go upside down, and people really start thinking that they go upside down. And I don't know what this is. Maybe it's the fact that our ears really can't tell whether we are upside down or not. We only feel G-forces, I'm pretty sure. So we really want to emphasize this fact here. Now, I decided to add a chimney here, and because I'm a little bit too much for paying attention to detail, I decided to also add a fireplace on the indoor section here, because it is a bit annoying seeing a chimney on the outside of the building that doesn't match up to anything inside the building or any possibility of there being some sort of a chimney system. Just how there's also this annoying thing sometimes where there's a window on the outside. Well, make sure there's a window on the inside as well. I mean, otherwise, I don't know, maybe this is just something that crazy people like me pay attention to and nobody else, but it does annoy me at least a tiny bit if things like this don't match up. Now, at this point, I decided to add some rock work to the castle, which is nice, because this castle is built to kind of look like it's built on a rocky outcrop of sorts, which is also something that castles very typically tend to be, because they tend to be good strategic points to place a castle down. But at the same time, it also helps me to hide some of the more ugly parts near the bottom of this castle, which I wouldn't know for sure what to do with them if I wouldn't place some rocks down there. And here is where I added the queue line, which isn't perfect. It's a tiny bit messy, but it's straight enough, I figured. I honestly couldn't be bothered to deal with the path tool any more than I already did. And I think it's actually fine, not to exaggerate. And it's nice that we can actually make some of those corners diagonal wherever the paths start meeting the walls, so I don't have to worry too much about my path clipping into the wall. And again, I'm using an interior wall here with some wood and plaster, and also some logs that hold up the roof that are actually quite lengthy as well. And then on the outside we have the rough rocky textures of the exterior walls. And that's again my general look for this place. I think the queue is one of the things I like least about this build. Normally I really try to theme my queues as much as possible and at least give them good views of the coaster, but in this case I really wanted to finish the castle building in a realistic looking sense, and I also wanted to make sure that it was also filled with stuff. And most of the castle is taken up by the dark ride portions of the coaster and the station and the brake run section and the exit path, but I still needed to fill some space with the queue line. So realistically, that's just where the queue line had to go. So unfortunately, we don't have any cool theming there or cool views of the coaster. We do have some views of the coaster once I get to a different part of the queue, but overall, it's more just functional. Although I guess it is a pretty atmospheric room with all of those beams and the lanterns and stuff like that, but overall, it is pretty simple. The same also goes for the dark ride portions of the coaster, by the way. The lighting is doing most of the work there. I didn't want to make it too interesting there. Now this is the more exterior part of the queue line, and I really didn't have much space for a queue here, so I am stacking this wherever I can. So we have a kettle pen indoors, and then we have this kettle pen, which is kind of indoors, kind of not, because it is built out of an outcrop out of the station, or out of the castle, which maybe was built later, because this is obviously not very good for defensive purposes, but it does look pretty cool, and I think this is the part of the build that is most reminiscent of Wernigerode Castle, which also has this sort of part jutting out with the timber frames. And I think this has the fun effect of having some actual windows. Because we don't have glass, I couldn't fill these windows with anything, so I'm just leaving them empty. But I think it works well enough, especially for a medieval build. And you can then see the sunlight go into these windows and into the queue, and the lighting is just... I love the lighting in this game in general. It's one of my main reasons to keep going. There have been many discussions the last few days about the quality of this game and about bugs and just overall user interface and all kinds of challenges. And I agree with many of the sentiments. I also think there's a lot of work to be done on this game to make it more user-friendly to play. But that said, I still enjoy it, and I think that's kind of the crux. There's a lot to hate about this game, but in the end I still love it, and it's really gotten my creative bone peaked again, so I'm super happy with that. I'm also happy with the updates that was recently announced. If you didn't know yet, Frontier announced that they are going to do a free update in December, which is going to fix some of the most requested features. They hinted something about the slide physics, so I'm pretty glad about that. They also said that load and unload stations will be a thing, and that there will be many user-friendliness updates on recoloring things and on using the UI. So overall, that seems really good. I also mostly hope that they are treating their employees well, because in some sense it also feels too good to be true. But yeah, do know that this is a thing, if you didn't somehow know that yet. Moving back to the coaster, here we have the backside, and I think this is actually probably my favorite side as far as the theming of the outdoor layout goes, because we have some fun head choppers and interactions with the castle here. Now we have this weird incline path, because once again I was trying to make this coaster also accessible to everybody, so that includes people who can't take stairs, and looking at a way to make this actually work. And eventually I ended up with this solution, making this very long exit path which slowly slopes up to the height of the station and then into a bridge which goes over the layout. But we also have a part where the track goes over the path here, so we have some fun interaction both directions, and we're gonna have some head choppers for the coaster there as well. So that was pretty fun to add and work on. Coincidentally, with work today I was looking into the maximum slopes for footpaths in the Netherlands, because there's actually a law for that called bouwbesluit, which is a general set of laws about what buildings and infrastructure should be. But unfortunately, this ramp is not actually in accordance to the rules that we have here. It's both too steep and too long, especially the combination, because the rules for ramps like this tend to be based on how long your ramp is or how high it is that you're going up, and depending on these variables, the maximum allowed steepness can also change. But for a ramp like this, it probably should have had a straight section somewhere in the middle, and it's probably also just too steep. But it is what it is. I really couldn't find a way to make this fit in better, but it does look like a slight challenge for wheelchair users, so apologies for that one. But again, I try to keep it realistic enough. Moving on, we have my favorite tower probably on this build. I might like this thing more than the main tower, because this tower isn't gonna get too tall, but it does get some cool interaction with the coaster, because we get this hole in the middle right here, which the coaster is gonna fly through, and you get airtime on a head chopper. And I don't know about this, but I think it's pretty rare. Usually head choppers are something that happens in the valley of a roller coaster, when you're moving underneath supports or a bridge or something like that. They don't tend to happen at the tallest part of a hill, Well, here it does. So hopefully, as you're going over this airtime hill and your body is flying up out of your seat because this thing is hitting, I think, minus 0.4 Gs, so that's some decent flowjector, some people would call it. So as that is happening, it should hopefully feel like your head is gonna butt straight into that stone wall in front of you, and that should be a pretty fun sensation. Ooh, and by the way, I didn't cut my fill out of this video. I tried doing this roof with fewer pieces, so using the actual in-game roof pieces to make this spire, but then I did that little experiment and I figured no, that does not look good. We have to return to our spire method. So back to the small, tiny wooden bricks it is. I mean, it's actually the resort wall decoration, specifically, which is a tiny piece that I scaled up to 300% to turn it into wooden shingles. And I think this is one of my favorite pieces in the game so far. I remember that one of the top comments on my first Planet Coaster 2 video build was something along the lines of, give this man a glass pane and a single brick and a single wooden bracket to start building some stuff. And I couldn't agree more with that. I love these tiny little pieces. Eventually, you know, I'm a big fan of all the big pieces and textures and things that they add into these games, and I hold nothing against them. But in the end, if you want to make things completely custom, and usually it is kind of how I work, that I try to envision things in my head and have an idea of what kind of roof shape I want to go for, what kind of textures I want to make. If you want to do these things, it just works best with small pieces. I didn't choose the 10K window frame life. It just happens to be how my ideas end up being worked out in a game like this. So, big ups to that tiny little wooden resort decoration, because that little thing might not be the most important piece in the game to Frontier, but it is definitely one of the most important pieces to me personally. I also love these Viking stone wall decorations though. There are just enough variations in them to build your custom cornerstones out of them like this, or wooden pillars, or arches like this. And because we have an old medieval castle, everything can be a little bit messy, so I like that. Although this roof in the middle here, which cannot be seen from any of the paths or the coaster, is a bit more of a modern element. In my lore, this is really just an inner courtyard which was covered by a modern roof to make room for this coaster, because realistically this should probably be where some sort of inner courtyard used to be located, but we now just have a simple modern roof which is gonna house some HVAC stuff and vents and stuff like that. And moving on to some other bits of scenery, here we have the trees and shrubs and all that good stuff. At this point in time, I was checking my piece count on this build and I realized that I was almost nearing 4,000 pieces. And you don't see this on video, but as I was doing all of this theming, I kept going back into some older sections and removing walls and pieces here and there. Anything that was invisible from any perspective, I decided to figure out where it was, remove it, and get one extra space on my maximum scenery allowance, because I was going to use my 4,000 pieces for this blueprint because I had to. Also, I don't have recordings of this, but I built a custom coaster car based on the old Eurofighter trains, which are very, very pointy and jagged, and I love their minimalistic nature. And with all this limited piece count stuff, I still had a few pieces left to build some light posts, so I also decided to add those in, as well as some custom footers, which I had to do here and there because the footers disappeared because of the rock work, and while they're not exactly the same as the in-game ones, I think they'll do the trick just fine. And finally, I added a path over here that people can connect to. It's not too complicated or themed, but it is probably quite useful if you're trying to place this blueprint down somewhere in your park. And that is it for the blueprints. Now, moving on, I still have a little bit of time-lapse left because I wanted to make this blueprint into something which has a surrounding, because right now it's just a green sandbox all around it. And I wanted to give an idea of what this blueprint could look like in an actual natural environment. And to do that, I looked up some inspiration from Elt's Castle in Germany, which is a really cool castle in the middle of a valley, which the setting is just really gorgeous. I think the setting is a big part of why the castle is so popular to visit. It's also somewhat similar to this castle in terms of its textures and overall composition, so that actually ended up working out as well. And this kind of valley can really just start forming by a meandering river, so I decided to add that in here as well. And also make a quick custom stone bridge using the archway pieces that I made for the small bridge of the coaster track earlier on in the video. And then these hills I am just going to make very muddy and very soily with a bit of rock here and there, which is not the best looking right now, but trust the process. This should all work out to create a realistic forest floor made up of many ferns and bushes, which I'm now going to slap on it. And man, I love these scenery brushes. These really make things like this so much more doable, because in the grand scheme of things, the time that I spent doing this is insignificant compared to the time that I spent building the actual blueprint itself. But just for how large this area is, and for how large these rivers are, and how much foliage there's on these things, it is really time efficient to do this kind of stuff. And it also looks pretty good, I think. So that's that for the terraforming. And for the trees, I decided to add a few custom trees here and there, as well as a weeping willow, because I am such a massive fan of that weeping willow. I think it's the nicest tree in the game, definitely better than the one in Planet Zoo. Even though I don't think all of the trees in this game look better than the ones in Planet Zoo, it is a huge improvement over Planet Coaster 1. Now this is where I also started using the brushes for the rock work. Eventually I decided to switch to a different type of rock, because I realized that these are the taiga rocks and they don't match up with the rock work that I used for the castle itself. So after placing a bunch of them down, I also removed a bunch of them because it didn't quite work out, but I did leave a few in just to have that mixture, which I think was nice. And it's fun to place these things using the brush, just brushing down and seeing if you like what you see, and if you don't, Ctrl Z and brush again and Ctrl Z until you have some rock work that you really like. And this way even the rock work barely takes any effort. And it's hard to notice on Timelapse because it goes by so quickly. But I did do a lot of undo redoing with some of this rock work to get what I was looking for. But eventually it is quite nice. Plus it makes the rock work very messy, which is nice for this look that I'm trying to go for. That it's just a bunch of boulders randomly scattered around, especially with some of the boulders that are almost entirely sunken into the water. I think it provides just the right contrast to make this thing look realistic and not like I hand placed each of those boulders to look specifically like the kind of rock work that I was looking for. So yeah, that's it for the coaster as well as its surroundings. I think it's time that I open this park and the coaster and take a look at how this thing looks in game. So let's do that. Oh yeah, look at that little Eurofighter doing its thing. Man, I love the continuous roll in this game. Also, I didn't even talk about this yet, but yes, this is where I put my transfer track, because I figured right down here in the basement where barely anyone noticed is probably the best place to put my transfer table. Or so I figured. And there it goes around, going through its first Immelman and over the airtime hill here, which actually has some crazy airtime into that roll element, and the dive loop here on this side with the airtime hill with the head chopper here through the tower, underneath the bridge, and through this final element with some sweet hang time down there. And as it should, a little bit of airtime as you pop into the brake run here. And then we enter the building, go through this hallway down here, and finally we end up in the big hallway where our station is located. So yeah, that is basically the build. And this is everything that you get with the blueprint as well. Let me quickly show off the custom car as well, because I barely showed that but it's basically a wooden variant of the more old style Eurofighter trains, which are much more sharp, I guess, and pretty simple. I really like their simple but sleek design. And this is the look of the castle, and it's a little bit of a weenie as you're walking through this area and towards the castle there, seeing it in the distance. So overall, I'm pretty happy with how this thing turned out and how some of the elements work out. And lastly, but not least importantly, the door mechanism as well, which we should be able to see when the next train arrives. So as it gets to the top of the lift hill, and there it is, climbing on the inside, the doors will open up just in time, and there it flies out down into that pretty crazy drop and loop over there. So yeah, that's it. If you want to give this thing a try for yourself or put it somewhere in your park, you can check out the code in the description below. For now, I'm going to leave you with some cinematic shots and a POV of the coaster, and I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.